Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Birch, and welcome to another A Health Detective podcast. And today, I would like to introduce you to Mia Moran. She's a very special lady, and I think you're going to get a lot out of today. Mia helps women balance motherhood, career, and health, which we all know can be a challenge for all of us. She is a best-selling author, a coach, and a mother to 3 teenagers. And she has a podcast herself, which I think is called Plain Simple.
Plain Simple.
So, Plain Simple. So, Mia, thanks for coming along today, and love to hear about your backstory before we sort of get into the nitty-gritty questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, by the way, for having me here. This is fun because I know that we're like on opposite sides of the world. I'm in the East Coast of the US, so very different places. My backstory is this. I'm like trying to think of where to go. My backstory is that, basically it started at age 9 when my mother took me to Weight Watchers. And she was doing it and she thought maybe I would want to too. And that sort of started this not so great relationship with food. So, that led to all the things like, over the course of college and whatnot, I tried every single diet, I did every single kind of exercise, all the different things. And then when I got pregnant, I just saw that as permission to my body's going to change anyway. So why follow all these rules? I'm going to eat whatever I want. And lo and behold, that actually helped because I was very nauseous and eating somehow helps nausea when you're pregnant. So I did that. And I have 3 kids, as you know, who are now teenagers. But at the time when I was having them, I had them within 5 years. So over the course of 5 years, I was either pregnant or nursing. And I basically ended up with 85 extra pounds. I know you guys don't do pounds, but 85 extra pounds on my body. And I just thought sort of that's what that was me becoming a mother. I don't know, but that happened. And meanwhile, I've always been an entrepreneur. At the time I owned a design company. And I just remember this one day I was at work and my kids, the youngest one was probably almost 1. And it was 3 p.m. and I had been working since 9. And I looked across my desk and there was this stack of 7 coffee cups that I had somehow gotten over the course of the day. And 2 things really struck me about that. First of all, I had left the office 7 times since I had gotten to work to buy coffee. But also I just had this thing that coffee, caffeine, it was supposed to make me energized. That's why I had gone to get it probably. And I was just exhausted. I was literally exhausted. And, I just remember that day being gosh, I really have everything I dreamed of. I ended up marrying, and I'm still married to him very happily, somebody who I met in high school. We had these 3 kids. We had an apartment that was our own. I owned this company. Literally I had checked off all the boxes. And yet here I was just exhausted and quite honestly, not very happy and hiding behind all the boxes I had checked off. So that was my wake up call. And I just remember deciding something's got to change. And the most obvious thing to me that was different than how it used to be was that I had these extra 85 pounds. And at first that brought up all the old shame and whatnot about it. But somehow that led me to my first ever yoga class. And I landed in this class and I'm an introvert by nature, but I just fell in love with the teacher and I introduced myself to her after class. And she basically gave me what I call my last diet. So she gave me a way to eat that I was not sure how I would do because I was not a cook. But she was not a cook either. And so she basically gave me the structure for what I wanted to think about versus this is all I could have. And so I just created 5 things and I literally ate the same things for 5 months. And I rid myself of seasonal allergies. I got my hormones intact. I was taking medicine for both of those things. My energy was through the roof within a week, and coffee was not part of what I was having anymore. And I was glowing, and the weight, I always say, melted off. I know it took a couple of months, but like, it wasn't even a thing because I felt so good. I call it like, I feel like it was like 10 years of therapy, like went into effect in 2 weeks. And so that was the first moment that I just understood that food would had a real impact on everything. And that just started this like quest of trying to understand everything I could understand about food and my body and all these things, including parenting and how I would pass this back on to my kids. And so, long story short, I ended up writing a book about parenting and food and how to really make the family healthy. And I went on a book tour. I took my kids out of school when that happened. This was like 5 years later. I took my kids out of school and took them on a book tour. And as I met really thousands of women, I was just constantly surprised how much more they actually knew about food than I even did. And yet they still felt really sure like they needed an answer to how they could feed themselves and their families better. And so eventually I just got this instinct to like ask them to take out their phones and look at their calendars. And it was impossible. Like they couldn't have time. Like they literally could not make dinner, sit down and eat it, go shopping for it. Like there was no time. They were working hard. They had kids who were doing other things. They were, tending to things around them. They were volunteering. Like they were just doing all these things. They were driving, and they might say they wanted dinner at 6:30, but they weren't getting home until 6:15, and they were feeling really defeated. And so that's when I really took on time. And I was like, oh, like maybe the problem has a little bit more to do with time. Now, listen, learning to cook was one of the most important steps I took, but really mastering my time was what allowed me to make all those changes over the years. So that's kind of the story of where I am now. And now I help people really create balance using time and the time that they have in a day.
Gosh, that's an amazing story, beautiful story, and pretty much encapsulates all the different components that I would really like to talk to you about more about today, and maybe expand a little bit on some of those ideas.
Yeah.
I think the first thing that really struck me with your story, though, was going to Weight Watchers when you were 9 years old.
Yeah, tell me about it.
How do you think that sets you up for body image and, perhaps a dysfunctional relationship with food?
Yeah. So, I mean, who knows? Like, I mean, I don't know I don't really remember what I had before, but my instinct is that was the moment, like I associated shame with my body, and it's interesting, like the actual experience connected me with my mother. So there was something about that I actually liked. But the biggest thing that I remember is, and I'm a rule abider by nature. So the idea of structure and whatnot was fine for me. Like that actually, I went into meal planning at first for a reason, because like the structure actually helps relax me. But I remember this one day when I went to a slumber party of somebody who was like a friend of the family. So I didn't really know anybody except the girl, and she had invited her whole class, and it was this big thing. And it was in the middle of all this. So like so I remember eating dinner before I went and then going to this slumber party. And then there was breakfast, and and somebody goes to hand me a piece of cake. I hadn't even said yes. I didn't eat it. But somebody handed me this piece of cake, and literally you could have like staged this. The door opened and in walked the Weight Watchers like woman. She was the mom of one of the kids. And so it was just in that moment where like I just made all these connections, I think, in my brain about food, shame, like willpower, like, you name it, just really unconsciously. And I don't think, I think my mom really understood after that moment. Like, I don't think I did it anymore, but it was just, it had happened. And so, yeah, so that was it. It was sort of shame, body. And It's interesting because it has been somewhat of my life's work to really undo that. And so this past year, you want to hear another story? So this past year, in the midst of COVID, first of all, I understood that like what she was passing on, I think a lot of times, we carry this shame, this body shame within us, but it's actually coming from like generations. We're really carrying everybody before us. And I think that we also have an opportunity to change things up and make it so that generations beyond us operate very differently. So I really believe that anybody who does the work on just loving their body so unconditionally, it's like the best work to do. So I'm a big fan of doing that work. But so I just started like following this string of like, wow, like, like my grandmother had this thing, my grandmother was always bringing up body image, like, oh, like she must've gotten it from her mother, and like how this really gets passed down. And so here I am, this, we've had healthy family dinners. I feel like I really leaned into that because I wanted to pass on a new story I have two girls. I mean, I want to pass it on to all my kids, but I was really conscious of passing on a new message to my girls. And since that moment 12 years ago, I've really done a lot of mindset work to clean up all my thinking around my body and really just loving the process. So in comes COVID, and I have a type A daughter, and she has a lot of food allergies, and it was stressful, and kick in disordered eating. And so all of a sudden it was like, shoot, all this stuff like still led her to this place. And so it's been this amazing healing process. And I actually feel like definitively I can say we've like, drawn a line in the sand for our family lineage, that it's never going to be the same, because she did some amazing work. I did some amazing work. And, yeah, I mean, it's just real, and it's rampant, and it's all around us. And it's so amazing when we can really fall in love with the bodies that are, walking around this planet, our own bodies that are walking around this planet. And it's, yeah. So that's what Weight Watchers led me to. So I'm actually grateful. I'm grateful for that, everything that's happened as a result of that 9-year-old thing, because I think it gave me this opportunity to pass on something really different to my girls. So that's been amazing.
And also to the world and to other
Yeah.
women, and also to men. I mean, this isn't just a message for women, to be honest.
Yeah. No, 100%.
For everybody. I called 2022 the year of self-care. I decided to give it a name.
I love it. So important.
Yeah. And I think, again, there's so many things in what you just said. I have to try and keep all these questions in my head. So one of the things is how closely related our self-care is to our self-worth, and you're talking about learning to love your body and accept your body. And I think we all know that at an intellectual level, but the problem is the way we go about it. And I think sometimes the messages or the techniques we try to use don't work, because, I had a client, only a few weeks ago say to me, it doesn't matter how often I stand in front of the mirror and look at myself and tell myself I'm beautiful. She said, I know I'm not, I'm fat. And she said, I'm not only fat, I'm obese, and I'm disgusted by myself. So she said, I can stand there and tell myself I'm beautiful all day long, but the other voice in my head is saying that's not true. So how do we switch that negative self-talk around so that we do feel worthy of taking care of ourselves without actually denying the reality of where we're starting this journey from?
Yeah. So for me and just clients I've served, I think it's really about finding a thought that is different, but that you can believe. So it might be too far to jump from like, I've thought of myself as this not beautiful person my whole life. And now I'm going to look in the mirror and say I'm beautiful. But I wonder if it's too much to look in the mirror and say, I'm on this journey and I'm committed to finding the beauty in myself, right? Like, so it's like, what is the thought that we can actually believe and actually stand behind? Because when we get to planning, we really have to start from that thought. And that's what helps us decide what we actually make time for, right? So if we're don't believe that we're beautiful and that's what we're trying to tell ourselves, then the things that end up on our to-do list are going to be for somebody who thinks they're beautiful. And that might not be the things that are actually nurturing us in that moment, right? Does that make sense? Or for somebody who thinks of themselves as beautiful. Personally, I think everyone's beautiful. So I hope everyone finds that at some point. And we really have to operate from what we are believing, or what we like, the bridge thought that we can get there. Like we can really get behind that we're like on the way to this place, or we're creating the skills, like just adding some disclaimers in there so you can really believe that you're on the path to this thing. And then what would somebody on the path do, right? So they might not look in the mirror and say they're beautiful, but they might take themselves on a 10-minute walk every morning and just feel their bodies, or they might be able to look in the mirror and say a different phrase, or, they might do thought work around just really finding the thoughts that they can believe in and start to get behind. Right. So it's like we so often, like, and I feel like I say this all the time in my group, which is, so often self-care becomes this to do. And the second it becomes a to do, it's not self-care, because the second it becomes a burden, like, that's not self-care. Self-care is not a burden. Self-care is taking care of us, and burdens don't take care of us.
And I think that's why I think it's so closely aligned to our self-worth.
Yeah.
And I like what you said about, acknowledging where you are, but saying to yourself, I am on a journey, and this is a journey of discovery. And I find thinking about what I'm going to do for self-care as I'm worthy of taking care of myself in this way. And that really changes the conversation I have with myself. I'm not forcing myself to do something. I'm doing it because I'm worthy of doing it. And it doesn't become a rigid structure, because I think, and you probably see this as well, but I know I see and hear from a lot of people that they talk about, I have to go on this diet, and then I have to follow this plan, and this is a structure. And then when I deviate, then I've failed. And now that doesn't work anymore. And now I've got to find a new one and another plan, and I've got to start again. And I think you touched on that a little bit, right in the beginning with your story, a little bit about that.
Well, and a piece of the story that I didn't quite go into was that, it's interesting because, that the story I told about getting healthy was probably like 12 years ago, because my youngest is 13. So about 12 years ago, that's when I really started feeling what it felt like to feel healthy. And that, again, that changed so many other things that I didn't even know were rooting from that, like just how I felt in my clothes and how I showed up to meetings. And, a lot of just like the food was just shit, and how I treated my body was affecting so many things. And so, that was a process and a practice for a couple of years to really get to a place where, like, I didn't know how to cook. So I had to learn how to cook, and I had to learn how to serve my family this way, and, all sorts of things. But then eventually I honestly was able to coast, like, right. So the habits stacked and I had them, and it was fine. And so there was a little piece of me that didn't understand yet that this wasn't an end destination. Like, I kind of thought I had like hit it, and then I turned 40 and all the random hormone stuff started happening, and all this, what's happening? Like, what's going on in my body? Like, like, this isn't, like, the same thing's not working anymore. I'm not feeling the same energy. I'm tired again. Like, Where's this little tummy coming from? All the things. And so actually I had to get to a place again where like, oh yeah, I'm not fixing anything. Like this is a body that I'm taking care of until the body's no longer breathing. Right. And it's always, it's a process. It's a practice. There is no end destination. It doesn't become better one day when I hit some goal. Like it is a practice to show up for this body every single day. And the more that I can sort of relax into that and feel good about the process, then things sort of start to fall into place and, feel good as a result of me feeling good about the process and the practice. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And I think a lot of that is about aligning your goals with your beliefs as well, because we have a lot of goals, but we don't really examine our belief systems to see whether we really believe that we can achieve those goals. We sort of set them because we think we should, or society might value them. And so I think learning to match your goals and beliefs together, because if you don't, you'll either change your belief, you either have to change your beliefs or you're just going to abandon your goals. So
yes. 100%.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So you talk about learning to cook, and one of the things that is very common amongst my clients is their love of food. They talk to me about their passion for food. They talk about food as that connection with their family when they prepare food for their family, that it's their way of demonstrating love, and they really like the feeling of connection, the family being together. So how do we change the quality of the food that we're sharing while we're still engaging in providing love? And you talked about history, and it's so fascinating because I had an amazing conversation with a lady yesterday about her history and her ancestry, and whakapapa, it's called here. And she talked about going back not just to her most recent ancestors, but to her a lot more distant ancestors, and then thinking about what they did and the lessons she can learn from that, and then passing that on to her children. So it blends in perfectly with what you're talking about today. And yeah, she was talking about how does she pass this on to the next generation?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Well, so first of all, one of the things that I saw really clearly this past year as I was thinking about the next generation in my lineage is I kept going very far back in the past, to understand what had come to me. But when I was thinking about the next generation, I was actually only thinking about my girls. And one day I had this visual of like, no, like there's going to be just as much out, if we can like solve our planetary problems, there's going to be just as much out as there was in the past. And so it was just like, it became bigger and more, I don't know. It just like the second I could see that, like if we can really solve that in this generation, then there's so much power, like there's so much ripple effect beyond just my girls, which sometimes wasn't always motivating enough, to be honest. So that was really helpful to understand. But I think what's really important in all that is like, we come up with these stories. Like one of the things I had was so my grandmother was like 5'1" and, under 100 pounds, and always wore high heels and was always dressed up to the T, and did think fat people were bad. That was a story that I had. Always had the best brownies and the best cookies in her house. And it was the first place everyone went. So, and she was harsh. Like she was a wonderful person, and she was a little rough around the edges, and she was very clear about what she liked and didn't like. And so at some level, the food served in her house, which she ate in these teeny tiny quantities, but others didn't necessarily come into her house and eat in these teeny tiny quantities, was love. But like, there's nothing more loving about brownies made out of butter than a salad. Like, we just made that story. Like, those were stories that we created over time, either from our family or from the media, like, just any magazine, showing like cookie, like just all the things, like all the media is telling us that all these other things are love, but there's nothing unloving about a healthy dinner. And so I think that's a story just to look at and deconstruct a little bit and just understand how that fits into your understanding. So one of the things that I did early on, and again, I was not like, I loved food, and I had to go back and make all these connections that food that food and I were connected, but I wasn't like a foodie. Like, that wasn't my thing. I didn't love looking at recipes. And actually, it's funny, I still don't love to cook. I just love to feel good. So as a result, I'm pretty happy in the kitchen. But really, one of the first things I did was I really went back and looked, and like one of the first things I made, so I eat pretty plant-centered diet at this point. And so one of the first things I did was I figured out how to make, like, every step of the way, actually, every time I've made little turns in what I'm eating, I figured out how to make brownies. So like, you can make brownies all sorts of ways. Nobody had, like, there wasn't like, there's the high sugar butter, real flour version of my grandmother isn't the only way. One of the initial things I found out when I changed my diet was actually I have celiac, and I have always had it. So I literally can't have gluten. So I literally can't, her brownies literally hurt me, And so it's like, if it's like a thing that we're really wanting to have a story about, we can make that thing healthy. Another thing I really focused on was like separating the people from the food. So I could tell amazing stories about my grandmother that had nothing to do with food. And so I could make food, and we could sit at the dinner table, and I could tell other stories about times I went to my grandmother's, right? Like, it didn't have to all go together. And so that was really helpful for me to start to separate. And I catch myself still, like, a child has a hard day, and I'm like, let's go to the bakery, right? Like, that's a correlation I'm making. Like, I don't have to make that correlation. So I'm always thinking back of like unwinding stories and really understanding how they've played. I mean, I feel like it's a pretty constant process to really understand. Does that answer the question? Now I'm forgetting what the original question was.
I think my question kind of got a bit waffly anyway. There's a whole lot of train of thought sort of like merging together. I think some really good points and some really good takeaways in there. So I'd like to get on to decision making. So you sound like you made a decision. You made a decision that you wanted things to be different. Yeah. And so that probably comes back to that setting that goal and those beliefs. But how important do you think making that decision is, and then planning how you're going to implement it? And I'm terrible at planning. I'm really good at making decisions, but I'm not very good at sitting down and writing out plans.
Yeah, so neither was I at first. So what I always say planning is it's actually just making decisions. Like, planning is just making decisions in advance of the moment. And so, at that time 12 years ago, when I was staring at those coffee cups, I just decided something's have to change. And the only thing I planned for was how, with 3 little kids and a business, I could get to yoga for 90 minutes. All right. So there was like some bit of like, I had to think about like, okay, I have this idea. I'm supposed to go to yoga. So now I have to like figure out how to make that work. Right. So that was the plan. The plan was to go to yoga. And then at some point I figured out that I could eat these different kinds of foods. At the time, what the protocol that I sort of fell in love with at first was being raw vegan, which was not something I adhere to now, but was what got me through that year. And so I had to make a plan to learn 5 things to make. Like, that was all the plan was, right? Like, so there wasn't really more of a plan, but for me, it's like a plan is just deciding the advantage of deciding in advance is that you're deciding from a place where your brain is not in fight and flight. So a lot of times with food and exercise and self-care, like if it's right now and I'm a little bit hungry and somebody brings a plate of brownies that, I didn't want an hour ago, but they smell really good and I'm in the moment, I might say, yeah, give me the brownie. Hell, like I only live once, right? But that's not the part of my brain that's really concerned about my future self. That's a whole different part of my brain that's at play in that moment. So I like to think of planning as it's an opportunity to be in your highest vibration and decide from this place what your future self wants, so that when you arrive in the now, like it was your future self when you were planning, your job is really to process the emotions that come up with the fact that your past self knew that your future self should have a salad for lunch and you really want a hamburger, like, right? And so it's like, how am I moving that through my body? Like, what is that bringing up? What can I solve about all the things I'm thinking just from like processing that emotion? And so for me, that's the benefit of planning, not knowing every single moment, but really making some of those key decisions, really making them. And then, seeing how that has to play into time in the future, whenever it needs to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's perfect. And I use a similar process with all my clients, where we think about that future self,
Yeah.
what that future self wants, but then we also go and we look at the challenges that are likely to come up. So
Yeah, I love that.
What's going to derail you today? Oh, mum rings up and needs something, or kid's sick at school. And so what are the solutions for that? Like, so that you've already got some strategies in your head about that. And what can you say no to? Can you say no to having to jump up and do something right now because somebody else has asked you? Is that okay to delay that? Or is it an emergency and you do need to go? Because those things happen too. And then the next thing is being able to forgive yourself for the detour. And I think of it as like you've got a journey and you're following your roadmap, but you detoured off the highway. And so, okay, so you had a detour, you find the next on-ramp and off you go again.
And that's actually the structure of planning can sometimes help with that too, right? Because it's like, if like planning is just sort of, to me, it's like the container, it's like the home base. So if you like go off the plan, great. Like you just come back in, like you don't need to wait till next Sunday. You don't need to, like, I feel like that we're always like, oh, I've ruined this week, so I'll wait till next week. But like, if the detour is just part of this deal, then we just learn how to plan for that too.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly right. So how do you prepare for a day? So there's a question for you. Do you have sort of a morning ritual or an evening ritual where you sort of think about your intentions for the next day and prepare for that?
Yes. So first of all, I just want to say, like, so when I'm thinking through goals and whatnot, like I'm generally thinking in 90-day chunks, because that one of the things I find about, especially anyone who's parents, women and men, but also just like in this day and age, like we just got out of a pandemic, like there's just like so many different seasons. And I feel like 90 days, like if we have a 90-day goal in the middle of a pandemic, we can do that. If we have a 90-day goal in the middle of summer, that's one thing. If we have a 90-day goal in the fall, it looks different than the one in the summer, right? Like, so a 90-day season, I think, is just a really great time to think about. So when I think about my day, I'm reflecting back on like, really, what is my focus? What have I already decided is my focus for this season? And I have a practice, it's funny, this is kind of like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? But so I have a practice in the evening where, assuming I've planned the day already before, I go through and I just look and I try to just it's like a practice of being objective and doing, like, letting like how you were talking, just being kind to myself, what we were talking about at the beginning. And so I may have like time block my day and said, I'm going to really focus on sitting for lunch today, or I'm going to, go do strength training or go on a walk, whatever my things are for the day, in the middle of my work or whatever. Right. So I've put that actually into time. So one of the things that's really important in a day is that, especially if you're operating from to-do lists, which I find women tend to do a lot, it's really important to decide what from that to-do list is actually going into time and where in a day, because to-do lists are just too abstract. And a lot of times we walk around with a to-do list that's for like months, and we think it should all be done in a day. So there's this practice of taking things from your to-do list and putting it into your day. So at the end of the day, I'm looking at that and of what I've put into time. And it's like, oh, interesting. I said I would sit for lunch, but then the phone rang and I took the call and I only had 5 minutes. So I ended up standing at the counter and eating. Right. So then I start to see those obstacles you were talking about, because I'm like, at the end of the day, I'm going through and I'm like, huh, interesting. Like, what do I learn from that? Maybe it's I shouldn't answer my phone during my lunch, or maybe it's that I shouldn't scroll social media, or maybe I need a little bit more time for lunch, or maybe I need to make time to call my mother if she's the person always calling during the thing, like whatever. So I really try to learn from where I've been derailed in a day. And then I go and I do for the next day. And when I'm looking at the next day, I'm really looking at what are the 3 things that I really want to promise myself I'll do, because like they're really for my future self, right? Like, what are the 3 things I'm going to do tomorrow that are really for my future self? And I decide what those are. And then I also decide what I'm going to eat for the next day. Like, and I may have meal planned for the week. I may have already decided all the things I'm going to do for the week, but each day I see that, like, when I think of planning, I'm thinking like sort of in between journaling and planning, because I think there's this like recommitting. Like, we could make a whole week's plan and ignore it by Thursday, but that's not really the purpose of planning. For me, it's like recommitting to my future self every evening and changing it if I need to, but just a little bit in advance. So like, if all of a sudden someone's home sick or there's a busy meeting, maybe I have to make lunch different. Maybe it has to be easier. Maybe it has to be something from the freezer. Like, I can switch it in that moment, but really still in advance. And so that's what I'm sort of looking at night. Like, what are those things that I'm really committed to? And then when I wake up in the morning, I relook at that list and just recommit to it, because I find that I need to recommit to my future self quite often, because I'm like, I have some aspirations. And I also start the day with gratitude. So before I recommit, I really sit down and I'm like, okay, what, and I don't even always sit down. Sometimes I have this piece of paper by me, or I have a planner that has this in it. Sometimes I just have it on my bedside table, and it's like, I'm looking out the window and I'm like, oh, I'm grateful for the tree, the snow. I'm grateful to be here next to my husband. I'm grateful that the dog is so cozy on the floor. Like, it doesn't need to be huge things. Like, sometimes there's huge things, but a lot of times it's all the little things, because I find that, like, one of the reasons to plan, one of the reasons to review each morning is really just to be operating from that higher vibration. Because the second we feel like we're not enough, or we're depleted before we start, or, we're scared, because there is definitely like a letting go and a almost like a death, like, that happens when we let go of all these old habits. I just find that if I can get into that higher vibration and then decide I'm going into my day, it goes so much better. So those are kind of some of the big things.
Yeah, I really love what you said about, picking 3 things for your future self. I think that is really important. And then each day you're recommitting to that. And by recommitting to that, what you're really saying is, who do I need to be to achieve that? How am I going to show up in the world today to achieve that?
And because a lot of times I think we think of ourselves, like, especially around health, it's like, I want to feel healthy. I want to feel happy. I want to feel free. Like, we have all these, like, I want to feel self-love. Like, I want to feel all these things. And then it's back to that idea of like a bridge. And it's like, who do I really need to be today to get to the point where I'm feeling joy? I might need to feel committed, or I might need to feel taken care of, or, there's other things I might actually need in order to be able to get there. So I think that that's really an important part of that process is understanding who you really need to be to become that person who can wake up really, in love with life and body and all the things.
And it's certainly a different energy, isn't it? And I know, you go through various phases in your life, and when you're waking up in that phase where it just feels like a struggle and you're not really being grateful for all the things you've got, all you can see are these overwhelming problems, and your brain is just recycling the same thoughts over and over again. And you wake up feeling exhausted, and you're giving off, you talk about the vibration or the energy, or, you're giving off complaining and exhaustion and sadness, and then the world around you changes. But when you can wake up and feel grateful, and then have that energy and excitement and joy for what the process is and how you're going to achieve that process, all your relationships with people change, your relationship with self
and
change.
just to clarify, like, I don't wake up every morning necessarily like ready to take on the world. So for me, the choice is more like, I could grab my phone right now and check my email and see that there's 100 things that people need me to do. Or I could check the news and get all, down on what's happening in the world or whatever. Or I can start with 5 minutes of just feeling gratitude and recommitting to what I want for my future self, and then check my phone, right? Like I've switched my energy. So like, it's not like, for me, I don't always wake up feeling like, sometimes I wake up feeling awful, but then it's like, what do I do next? Do I let more awful in and then really feel like I have no control, or, which I do from time to time, or do I like really remember the control that I do have, especially over my mind?
This is really fantastic stuff, and I'm so appreciative of you sharing it with us. You have a podcast. Can you tell us just a little bit more about your podcast? Because I think people would find it really valuable,
Absolutely. Maybe you'll be on it someday. So it's called the Plan Simple Podcast. And I do a combo of having conversations with people and teaching about planning, but it's a lot of conversations with people just like this. And my goal is really, to have enough conversations where we're really simplifying things that a lot of us put, a lot of drama behind. We're simplifying it. So when somebody tunes in and listens and they're like, oh my gosh, I just like, it's taken me years to find a primary care doctor, we have somebody on there who really is sharing how to, go about getting your insurance and finding the doctor and what the process is and all the stuff. So it's like, how can we make life very complicated, and it can be so simple. And simple doesn't mean easy, but simple does mean that we're not making it unnecessarily complicated. And then we have that time and space to process the emotions, which I think is really the work that we're all here to do to become our best selves. So we just try to simplify anything. And mostly it's to do around, food and wellness and lifestyle things and spirituality. So, I mean, we cover a lot of bases and work, because what I really want us all to think about is all of, all the different components of life together, because we have these silos of like, this is our food and wellness, and this is what we're doing, and this is our work schedule. And what I found when I was on that road trip was like, everyone had all these silos, and none of them were, somebody might want to eat really well and have this meal plan, but then they literally were working all day and then doing all these activities with the kids, and there was no time. So when we bring all that together, then we can see how they all play together more nicely. So that's what it's about.
It's excellent. Is there anything that comes up as quite a common theme for you that I haven't asked you about today or we haven't covered off today?
I think it's like, so planning is definitely like the first thing that comes up for people is like, well, like my life is already too full. Like I don't have any more time. Like how the hell am I going to have time to like plan my meals and like do this process that, does take, I do spend sometimes 15 minutes to a half hour a day really thinking about what's next, like being in this space or, and a lot of these self-care things, it's like, 10 minutes of meditation or working out, and it is adding to our already busy lives. But I just think that there's certain things that we add which actually bend time. And a lot of these wellness practices are part of that. So taking time to be quiet, taking time to take care of our bodies, taking time to plan, this actually starts to make work more efficient and take less time. It makes our relationships like, when we feel good, we pour goodness into our relationships and then we don't spend time fighting with other people. So it's like, it's all related. And sometimes we do have to put time into other areas, but then they make the other areas where we think we have no time left because they're feeling draining. We sort of pump life into them. And time really starts to bend in ways that it's hard to even explain until we experience it. So just allowing yourself the benefit of spending time on some, all the things that you're talking about on this podcast and just like seeing how that starts to shift your perception of what's possible in a day.
And I think I find the best thing I can do in the day is stick my phone on airplane mode. And
yes.
well, actually, yeah, I mean, putting it away somewhere where it's an effort to go and get it, because it is so easy to, a friend sends a message or the phone rings, and it's my beautiful daughter and I want to have a chat with her. And so I always feel like I want to answer the phone. Whereas
absolutely.
If it's away somewhere else and on
and our thoughts take up time too, which is the other thing I don't think anyone realizes. Like with meal planning, there was this study done that people think about what's for dinner, like not even breakfast, lunch, or any snacks, for an average of a half hour to an hour a day. If you add that up, that's like 3 weeks of vacation if you're working. Like, like it's a lot of time. It's funny, right before we got on, I was coaching someone and, whatever. Usually my coaching style is just so loving and so, just loving, I guess is the right way to explain it. But I was just finding myself just saying like, just do it, because I could see that like the thinking part, like getting all the assessments and, really understanding her personality type and whatever, like she was just needing to do 15 minutes of physical therapy a day. And she was literally spending hours on why she wasn't able to do this. And it's like, at some point, it's like, just give yourself the benefit of following through and spending the 15 minutes on taking care of your body and see what that leads to. Because sometimes we can't figure it out all in our brains. Like we just have to commit to doing it. And for me, planning has been really helpful in that.
And I think there's a lot of research showing that writing it down and physically writing it rather than using a computer. And I use I have a online diary, but I also use a paper diary because I just find that it does stick in my brain better, and I do commit a lot better when I'm actually physically writing.
And we have to just remind ourselves all the time. So like, that's a part of it, is just like really knowing that like, that's fine. We don't have to have it all in our head. It's great to have it on paper and a digital calendar, like wherever you need it, to remember like what's really in alignment with your future self. Like, who cares if you have to write it 100 times, right? Like we just need that kind of reminder, especially as we're growing.
And I know for me, my daily planning is often just repeating the same messages myself day, and I'm like, oh, I did that yesterday, but I still just need to keep repeating that message to myself. And the challenges always seem to be the same as well. And lately I've been going, okay, there's a pattern to these challenges, so it's about time to change it up and start, start replacing them with something else. Because for me personally, I find replacing maybe a bad habit is better than trying to say, I'm not going to do that anymore. It's instead of that, I think, okay, before I pick up the phone and start scrolling through Facebook, I'm going to think of 5 things I'm grateful for today, so that I replace those habits.
Yeah. Well, and I think that and I know you just asked like 10 questions ago, like, what's the last thing you would say? But that's where it's like really important to come from like a good feeling. So like, in my program, we actually meet every Monday and like discuss what are the 3 things for this week. Like everybody's declaring it every Monday. And there might be somebody who it's like every Monday, it's the same thing of I'm going to exercise 3 times this week, but I can tell by her energy that that's still exciting. She's still on the journey. It's like something that she's super excited to be a habit. So it's one of the 3 things. And it's not like weird or draining that it's still happening. But then I'll hear somebody else and they'll be like, oh, I have the same thing as last week. And the second somebody says it that way, I'm like, well, that doesn't sound very motivating. So like, what do you really need to be having in it this week? And a lot of times it's like they've put something really big. And so what you need to do is pull the little thing out of it. So it's like, maybe it's like a weight loss goal or eating dinner. So it's like, well, what is the big thing for this week? And maybe it's about shopping, or maybe it's about actually getting people to the table. Or sometimes it's what you talk about, like relating to it has to do with the obstacle. Like, how can you change it by responding to the obstacle instead of repeating the same thing again? And it's funny because sometimes when you put new life into what is, seems like the same thing, it's really important that it's exciting and you can be curious about it, and it starts off feeling good, even if in the moment when it shows up you're like, I don't really want the salad, but it's important that it starts off that way. I think that's really important.
And just listening to you talk, then it just really struck me how important things like these podcasts are for people, because sometimes you can feel very alone when you're trying to work on the stuff by yourself, and you need some inspiration, and hearing the message come from different people in different ways using different language. So, even though the message is similar, each one of us has a different way of applying it, a different way of thinking it. We use different thoughts and language around it. And so every time I talk to somebody, on the podcast about these kinds of ideas, I go away with reinvigorated and with,
me too.
Oh, that's a great idea. I can add that practice. I can add that into my daily practice. And so that's quite stimulating when sometimes you feel like you're a bit stuck in an environment where maybe you haven't got as much support around you as, you would need or like.
Yeah, it's so important.
I'm just looking at the time. I could talk to you for so much longer because
I know
there's so much stuff to talk about. But yeah, I'll let you go because you've probably got other things to do. And I will make sure I share all your website and your podcast and all your links in the show notes. Any one last thoughts?
Well, so if you do follow those from the show notes, the course that we have that's free on our website is that process of what to do each day. So that's what we sort of share, how to get from overwhelm to ease through a daily practice. So it goes into much more detail than my 30-second little thing. So that would definitely be a tool that anyone's welcome to come get.
Excellent. Well, I'll make sure that I get that out there and shared I try and gather as many tools from as many people as I can. And
awesome.
Because I think having the message coming in different ways is really important.
But also, if there was one closing thought from I think it circles back to the beginning, and it's like planning, eating better, like whatever the goals are that are coming up, like the more we can check in and make sure that they're coming from a place of like self-love, self-respect, which is how we sort of started. And really just the next step should always, like if we're out of alignment there, the next step should always be getting back into alignment with that before I think anything else. And that's the thing that's made the biggest difference in my life. Like, so, if I'm going to do a detox or change something I'm eating, like I really now check in and I'm like, is this coming from a place of love, or is this coming from that 9-year-old self who felt so much shame in Weight Watchers? Like, so it's like, who's making this choice? And I just really check in and make sure that it's my future self who, is standing tall and totally embodied and all of that. And I think that like, and I spend time, like, so if I'm not ready to do the detox, then I spend time getting my mind in the right place so that when I say yes, I'm not beating myself up. And I think that's the thing. Like, if anyone who's listening is stuck in that cycle of beating ourselves up, which we seem to be pretty good at as humans, that's where I think it's so worth spending the time and then taking action from that space of love and worthiness.
I think that's an amazing place to end this. We could talk for ages about negative self-talk and stuff. Maybe we could do that another day, but thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to meet you.
You too.